The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his pristine red tunic for the third time. His mount, a magnificent black gelding named Thunder, stood perfectly still. Beneath him, every muscle trained for the ceremonial duties that lay ahead. Thunder had served in the household cavalry for 7 years, his glossy coat and steady temperament making him one of the most reliable horses in the royal stable. The day marked the Queen's annual birthday parade, known as Trooping the Color, and thousands of spectators had already begun gathering along the mall. James could feel the electricity in the air, that peculiar mix of excitement and nervous energy that always accompanied major royal ceremonies. Thunder's ears twitched slightly, picking up sounds that human ears couldn't detect, but his posture remained calm and professional. As one of the senior members of the lifeguards, James had participated in countless ceremonies with Thunder. They had formed an unbreakable bond over the years, built on trust and countless hours of training. Thunder knew every route through London, every ceremonial position, and every musical cue that signaled the next movement in their elaborate choreographed displays. The preparation had begun hours before dawn. Grooms had carefully brushed Thunder's coat until it gleamed like polished obsidian, braided his mane with military precision, and fitted him with the ceremonial tack that weighed nearly 40 pounds. The breastplate bore the royal cipher, polished to mirror brightness, while the elaborate plume on Thunder's headpiece swayed gently in the morning breeze. James ran his gloved hand along Thunder's neck, feeling the familiar warmth and strength beneath the surface. The horse had carried him through rain and shine, through crowds of cheering tourists and the solemn silence of state funerals. Today should have been no different from any other ceremonial duty, just another display of British pageantry that tourists would photograph and locals would watch with quiet pride. The other guards were taking their positions, their horses equally magnificent and well-trained. Each animal had been selected for its temperament, size, and ability to remain calm under pressure. The training process took years, gradually exposing the horses to loud noises, crowds, and unexpected situations until they became virtually unflappable. Thunder had always been exceptional in this regard. While other horses might startle at a car backfiring or a child's sudden scream, Thunder would simply flick an ear and continue his steady pace. His breeding traced back to Irish sport horses, known for their intelligence and steady nerves, qualities that made them perfect for ceremonial duties. As the clock approached the departure time, James could see the crowds growing thicker along the parade route. Barriers had been erected to keep spectators at a safe distance, and police officers were positioned at regular intervals. The atmosphere was festive, with people waving small Union Jack flags and children perched on their parents' shoulders for a better view. The radio in James's earpiece crackled to life with final instructions and timing updates. Everything was proceeding according to the carefully rehearsed schedule that had been planned months in advance. Weather conditions were perfect, with clear skies and minimal wind that wouldn't interfere with the ceremony or the horse's performance. Thunder shifted slightly beneath him, not from nervousness, but from the natural readiness of a well-trained cavalry horse preparing to move out. James could feel the animal's controlled energy, like a coiled spring waiting to be released into the familiar rhythm of ceremonial march. What neither James nor Thunder could have anticipated was the addition to today's celebration that hadn't been included in any of their briefings. Local community groups had been granted permission to join the festivities with their own small parade, complete with steel drums, air horns, and a collection of musical instruments that would create a cacophony unlike anything the ceremonial horses had ever encountered during their training. The stage was set for a day that would test every aspect of Thunder's training and James's horsemanship skills in ways they had never imagined possible. The first indication that something unusual was happening came as a distant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Thunder's ears pricked forward, swiveling like radar dishes trying to locate the source of the unfamiliar sound. James felt the subtle change in his mount's posture, the slight tensing of muscles that indicated heightened awareness. The household cavalry had begun their procession from Buckingham Palace, moving in perfect formation down the mall toward horse. Guards parade. Thunder fell into his familiar rhythm, the steady clip-clop of hooves on asphalt creating a percussion that had accompanied British ceremonies for centuries. The crowds lining the barriers cheered and applauded, their voices creating a wall of sound that the horses had long since learned to ignore. James maintained his position in the formation, his eyes scanning the crowd with the trained awareness of a professional soldier. Everything appeared normal, typical of the thousands of ceremonial events he had participated in throughout his career. The other horses in the formation were equally calm, their riders sitting tall and proud in their gleaming uniforms. But the distant rumble was growing stronger, accompanied now by what sounded like a chaotic mixture of drums, horns, and whistles. It wasn't the organized music of a military band, with its predictable rhythms and familiar melodies. This was something entirely different, a collision of sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Thunder began to show the first signs of unease. His step became slightly irregular, no longer maintaining the mechanical precision that had been drilled into him through years of training. His head turned slightly from side to side, trying to identify the source of the approaching cacophony, that his acute hearing was picking up long before the human participants could fully process it. The community parade, organized by local Caribbean and African cultural groups, had been scheduled to merge with the official ceremony as a gesture of multicultural inclusion. What the organizers hadn't fully considered was the impact that traditional steel drums, air horns, whistles, and cowbells would have on horses that had been trained to respond to very specific types of musical cues. As the two parades converged, near Trafalgar Square, the carefully orchestrated world of military precision collided with the joyful chaos of cultural celebration. The steel drums created a thunderous metallic ringing that seemed to come from everywhere at once, while multiple air horns blasted randomly, their piercing shriek cutting through every other sound like a knife. Thunder's training began to war with his natural instincts. Every fiber of his being told him to flee from these alien sounds that his nervous system interpreted as potential danger. Yet 7 years of conditioning instructed him to maintain his position, to continue moving forward regardless of external distractions. James felt his mount's confusion through the connection that exists between experienced horse and rider. Thunder's stride became choppy and uncertain, his breathing more rapid as stress hormones began flooding his system. The familiar weight of his rider and the comforting routine of ceremonial duty were being overwhelmed by sensory input that his brain couldn't categorize or dismiss. Other horses in the formation were beginning to react as well. Some started prancing sideways, their riders working to maintain control while trying to preserve the dignity of the ceremony. The lead horse, a gray mare named Duchess, actually reared slightly before her experienced rider brought her back under control. The crowds, initially excited by the unexpected fusion of traditional ceremony with cultural celebration, began to sense that something wasn't quite right. The precision formation was becoming ragged, and several horses were clearly showing signs of distress. James made a split-second decision to use his voice, speaking to Thunder in the calm, reassuring tone that had worked in training situations. But his words were completely drowned out by a particularly aggressive blast from 3 air horns being blown simultaneously just 30 feet away. Thunder's world had suddenly become unpredictable and threatening. Everything he had been trained to trust was being challenged by this assault on his senses that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The moment when Thunder's training finally gave way to primal instinct arrived without warning. A child in the crowd had brought a small plastic horn that produced an especially shrill whistle when blown. The sound, innocent enough in isolation, proved to be the final straw for a nervous system already pushed beyond its limits. Thunder exploded into motion with the sudden violence of a compressed spring being released. His powerful hindquarters bunched and launched both horse and rider sideways, away from the formation and toward the crowd barriers. James, despite his years of experience, found himself fighting to maintain his seat as Thunder's body twisted beneath him in ways that defied the normal physics of horsemanship. The spectators nearest to their position suddenly realized they were no longer watching a carefully controlled ceremony, but witnessing a genuine emergency. Parents grabbed their children and stepped back from the barriers as Thunder's iron-shod hooves struck the pavement with sparks flying from the contact. Thunder's eyes had gone wide, the whites showing in that unmistakable sign of equine panic. His nostrils flared as he sucked in huge amounts of air, his entire body rigid with the fight-or-flight response that had kept his ancestors alive on ancient battlefields. The elaborate ceremonial tack that had looked so magnificent just minutes before now seemed to constrain and confuse him further. James tried every technique in his considerable arsenal of horsemanship skills. He maintained a firm but gentle contact, with the reins using his legs to attempt to direct Thunder's explosive energy into manageable channels. His voice, though completely inaudible above the continuing chaos of the steel drums and air horns, continued offering the familiar commands that had worked so well in controlled training environments. But Thunder was no longer the calm, reliable ceremonial horse of just minutes before. He had become a frightened animal, whose only thought was escape from the sensory overload that his brain interpreted as mortal danger. His training hadn't prepared him for this level of auditory chaos, and his natural instincts were demanding immediate flight from what seemed like threats coming from every direction. The other horses in the formation were experiencing varying degrees of the same crisis. Some were prancing and fighting their bits, while others had begun to rear or attempt to turn away from the source of the disturbing sounds. The careful choreography of the ceremony was dissolving into barely controlled chaos as riders struggled to maintain any semblance of formation. Police officers stationed along the route began moving toward the barriers, recognizing that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Radio calls went out for backup and veterinary support, though no one was quite sure what kind of assistance would be most helpful in dealing with multiple panicked horses in the middle of central London. Thunder made a sudden decision to leap over a low section of the barrier that separated the parade route from the sidewalk. The jump, executed with the athletic ability that made him such an impressive ceremonial mount, carried both horse and rider into the crowd of spectators who scattered in genuine terror. Landing among the confused tourists and local residents, Thunder found himself in an even more chaotic environment. People were running in all directions, children were crying, and the sounds that had initially triggered his panic were now coming from behind him as well as ahead. His mental map of familiar surroundings had been completely scrambled. James realized that conventional riding techniques were not going to be sufficient for this situation. Thunder's panic had reached a level where rational communication between horse and rider was nearly impossible. The animal's entire focus was on escaping from perceived threats, and nothing in his immediate environment felt safe or familiar. The crowd began forming a rough circle around them, giving Thunder space while trying to help guide him away from traffic and toward the relative safety of nearby St. James's Park. Several experienced horse people in the crowd recognized the signs of equine panic and began speaking in calm voices, though their words were still largely drowned out by the continuing noise from the cultural parade. Thunder's breathing had become labored, not from physical exertion but from the stress response that was flooding his system with adrenaline and cortisol. His magnificent black coat was beginning to show patches of sweat despite the cool morning air. What happened next would be talked about for years among the horsemen and women of the household cavalry. As Thunder found himself surrounded by concerned but unfamiliar faces, a small girl no more than 8 years old stepped forward from the crowd. Her name was Emily Chen, and she had been visiting London with her grandmother when the chaos erupted. Emily had grown up on a small farm in Wales where her grandfather kept rescue horses. She possessed that intuitive understanding of equine psychology that some people are born with, combined with the fearlessness that only children seem to have in truly dangerous situations. While adults around her were focused on the drama and potential danger, Emily saw only a frightened animal that needed help. Moving slowly and deliberately, Emily approached Thunder with her hand extended, palm up, in the universal gesture of peace that horses have understood for thousands of years. Her young voice, clear and high, somehow managed to cut through the background noise that was still emanating from the cultural parade several blocks away. Thunder's ears, which had been pinned back against his head in fear and frustration, slowly began to swivel toward this new sound. There was something different about this voice, something that didn't carry the tension and panic that surrounded him. His wild-eyed stare began to soften as he focused on this small figure who seemed completely unafraid of his size and obvious distress. James, still maintaining his seat through sheer determination and years of training, felt the subtle change in Thunder's body language. The rigid tension that had been building in the horse's muscles began to ease slightly, though he remained ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Emily began speaking to Thunder in Welsh, the lilting language of her childhood that somehow seemed to bypass the horse's panic response and connect with something deeper. She wasn't giving commands or trying to control him, simply offering a constant stream of gentle sounds that created a bubble of calm in the chaos surrounding them. The crowd, recognizing that something remarkable was happening, began to quiet down and give Emily more space to work. Parents pulled their children back, and the adults formed a wider protective circle around the girl, the horse, and his rider. Thunder took a tentative step toward Emily, his nostrils flaring as he tried to process her scent and determine whether she represented safety or another threat. His extensive training in reading human body language told him that this small person carried none of the tension and fear that surrounded the other spectators. Meanwhile, the official response to the situation was beginning to mobilize. Veterinarians from the Royal Mews had been contacted and were racing through London traffic to reach the scene. Police units were working to establish a larger safety perimeter, and the cultural parade had been temporarily halted to reduce the noise levels that had triggered the original crisis. James found himself in the unusual position of being a passenger, on his own horse, trusting in the instincts of a child he had never met to help resolve a situation that his years of professional training hadn't prepared him for. He could feel Thunder's breathing beginning to slow and his posture starting to relax as Emily continued her gentle Welsh monologue. Thunder lowered his massive head toward Emily, allowing her to place her small hand on his muzzle in the first physical contact he had accepted since the chaos began. The gesture seemed to flip a switch in his nervous system, reminding him of countless gentle interactions with grooms and handlers during his years of service. The crowd held its collective breath as Emily slowly reached up to stroke Thunder's neck, her movements deliberate and confident despite her small size. Thunder's eyes, which had shown only white-rimmed panic just minutes before, began to return to their normal, calm expression. James seized the opportunity to dismount, recognizing that Thunder's recovery would be faster if he wasn't also dealing with the weight and movement of a rider. As his feet touched the ground, he found himself standing beside a remarkable little girl who had accomplished what trained professionals were still struggling to achieve with the other horses in the formation. Thunder's transformation wasn't complete, but the foundation for his recovery had been established by someone who saw him not as a ceremonial mount or a military asset, but simply as a frightened animal that needed reassurance and kindness. The arrival of Dr. Sarah Williams, the senior veterinarian from the Royal Mews, brought professional expertise to what had become an unprecedented situation. She had treated Thunder for minor injuries and routine health checks throughout his career, and her familiar presence added another layer of comfort to his gradually stabilizing world. Dr. Williams approached slowly, her experienced eye taking in Thunder's condition, while acknowledging the remarkable work that Emily had already accomplished. The horse's vital signs were still elevated, but he was no longer showing the extreme stress responses that had characterized the first 20 minutes of the crisis. James briefed Dr. Williams on everything that had happened, from the initial trigger of the community parade's noise to Emily's intervention. As they spoke, Emily continued her gentle interaction with Thunder, now switching between Welsh and English as she told him stories about the horses on her grandfather's farm. The odd crowd that had gathered around them represented a cross-section of London life. Tourists with cameras documented the scene, though most had the good sense to keep their distance and avoid using flash photography. Local residents who had come out to watch the ceremony found themselves witnessing something far more memorable than the usual pageantry. Thunder's recovery was proceeding in stages, each small improvement building on the previous one. He had begun to respond to familiar voice commands from James, though his attention remained focused on Emily, who seemed to have become his anchor point in a world that had temporarily lost all its familiar reference points. Dr. Williams made the decision to administer a mild sedative to help Thunder complete his transition back to normal behavior. The injection was barely noticed by the horse, who was now allowing multiple people to approach and touch him, though he clearly preferred Emily's presence to anyone else's. The larger ceremony had continued without the household cavalry, the organizers making quick adjustments to accommodate the unexpected absence of the mounted units. The cultural parade had also been modified, with the steel drums and air horns being temporarily silenced to prevent further incidents with the remaining horses in the area. News of Thunder's panic and Emily's intervention had spread through social media with the lightning speed that characterizes modern communication. Videos taken by spectators were already being shared around the world, many focusing on the remarkable sight of a small girl calming a massive ceremonial warhorse through nothing more than patience and kindness. As Thunder's condition continued, to stabilize, the question of how to get him safely back to his stable became the primary concern. The route back to Buckingham Palace would require navigating through streets still filled with crowds and potential noise sources that could trigger another panic episode. Dr. Williams suggested using a horse trailer, but Thunder had never been trained for loading under stress conditions, and forcing the issue could undo all the progress that had been made. James proposed walking him back through the quieter streets of St. James's Park, keeping away from the main crowds and noise sources. Emily's grandmother, who had been watching the entire drama unfold with a mixture of pride and concern, finally approached to check on her granddaughter. She found Emily completely absorbed in her interaction with Thunder, seemingly oblivious to the crowd of adults and officials that surrounded them. The decision was made to attempt the walk back to the Royal Mews, with Emily and her grandmother, accompanying the group to provide continuity for Thunder's recovery process. Police units were assigned to clear and secure the route, ensuring that they would encounter minimal noise and disruption during the journey. As they prepared to move, Thunder showed his first signs of returning to his trained behavior. He responded correctly to James's commands to walk forward, though he consistently turned his head to check that Emily was still nearby. His step was still somewhat irregular, but the explosive panic that had characterized his earlier behavior was completely gone. The walk through St. James's Park became an impromptu procession, with curious onlookers following at a respectful distance while Emily continued her conversation with Thunder, now switching to describing the sights and sounds of London from a horse's perspective. 3 months after the incident that would forever be remembered as Thunder's Day, the effects of that chaotic morning continued to ripple through the traditions and protocols of the household cavalry. Thunder had returned to active duty, but with a modified training program designed to gradually expose him and other ceremonial horses to a wider variety of sounds and situations. Emily Chen had become something of a celebrity, though her family worked hard to keep her grounded despite the attention. She received letters from horse lovers around the world, and several equestrian organizations had offered her scholarships for advanced riding instruction. The video of her calming Thunder had been viewed millions of times, inspiring countless people with its demonstration of the connection possible between humans and animals. Thunder himself seemed to have gained confidence from surviving his ordeal. His handlers noted that he was more responsive to voice commands and appeared to have developed a deeper trust in human guidance. The experience had taught everyone involved that even the most highly trained animals could be pushed beyond their limits by unexpected circumstances. James Mitchell continued his service with the Life Guards, but he had also become an advocate for updating the training protocols used with ceremonial horses. His detailed report on the incident led to significant changes in how the cavalry prepared for events that might include non-traditional sounds and crowds. Dr. Sarah Williams used the case as the foundation for several academic papers on equine stress response and recovery techniques. Her documentation of Thunder's physiological changes throughout the crisis provided valuable insights for veterinarians working with horses in high-stress environments. The organizers of future royal ceremonies implemented new protocols requiring detailed coordination between all participating groups. Sound levels were monitored and controlled more carefully, and contingency plans were developed for managing horses that might experience similar stress reactions. Emily's grandmother, Mrs. Chen, had initially worried that the incident might have traumatized her granddaughter, but Emily showed no signs of fear or anxiety about the experience. Instead, she had begun volunteering at local stables and had started learning more about equine behavior and psychology. The relationship between Thunder and Emily hadn't ended with that dramatic day in London. Emily and her grandmother made regular visits to see Thunder at the Royal Mews, where she had become an unofficial part of his care routine. The stable staff noted that Thunder was always more relaxed and cooperative on days when Emily visited. The incident had also led to broader discussions about the welfare of working horses in urban environments. Animal rights organizations used Thunder's story to advocate for better protections and training standards, while supporters of traditional ceremonies argued that the event demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of well-cared-for animals. 4. Thunder himself, the lasting impact seemed to be positive. He had learned that panic and chaos could be survived, that trusted humans would help him through difficult situations, and that recovery was always possible. His performance in subsequent ceremonies was, if anything, more confident and assured than before. The steel drums and air horns that had triggered the original crisis were not banned from future events, but their use was now carefully coordinated with the cavalry units. Musicians were briefed on the sensitivity of the horses, and buffer zones were established to prevent the kind of sensory overload that had overwhelmed Thunder and his companions. Years later, when James Mitchell retired from active service, he would often tell the story of Thunder's panic and Emily's intervention to new recruits. He used it as an example of how quickly situations could change, how important it was to remain calm under pressure, and how sometimes the best solutions came from the most unexpected sources. Thunder continued his ceremonial duties well into his later years, becoming one of the most experienced horses in the Royal Mews. He never again experienced the level of panic that had overwhelmed him that day, but he also never forgot the small Welsh-speaking girl who had helped him find his way back to safety when his world had become too loud and frightening to bear alone.